everyone. I'm Joan Liashenko from the Center for Bioethics and the School of Nursing, and I welcome you to the final center seminar of the academic year. Thank you for taking the time from your busy schedules to come, and I'm confident that you won't be disappointed. There are two business matters. If you're a biomedical engineering student and you want continuing education credit, please sign up in the back. Anyone else who wants information about how to apply for CME, also sign up in the back, please. Before introducing our speaker, I want to acknowledge the support of our co-sponsors, the Department of Family Social Science and the School of Medicine Department of Pediatrics. Today's program would not have been possible without the hard work and considerable organizational talents of Ms. Leanne Hoekstra of the Center for Bioethics, so a warm thank you to you, Leanne. Hilde Lindemann, who has also written as Hilde Lindemann Nelson, is a professor of philosophy at Michigan State University, and it is my personal pleasure to introduce her to you today. Her areas of research include bioethics, feminist ethics, narrative approaches to ethics, and moral psychology. She is, in my view, one of a handful of the most distinguished and important scholars working in bioethics today. This distinction and importance is marked by both the quantity of her work and by the content of her work. Let's do the numbers first. She has published 5 books, 5 edited collections, 42 refereed journal articles, 29 publications and edited collections. She has presented 28 refereed papers, 30 endowed lectures and plenary talks. I don't know how she's ever home, but okay. And an astounding 117 invited talks. She has served as president of the American Society for Bioethics and Humanities. She has been a Hastings Center Fellow, a Woodrow Wilson Fellow, and a Fulbright Scholar. She served as editor of Hypatia, the Journal of Feminist Philosophy, and associate editor of the Hastings Center Report. She is on the advisory board or editorial board of several major journals, including International Journal of Feminist Approaches to Bioethics, Narrative Inquiry in Bioethics, Journal of Bioethical Inquiry, Soundings, American Journal of Bioethics, and this wonderful, interesting journal called Storytelling Self-Society, an interdisciplinary journal of storytelling studies. As to the content of her work, the overarching theme is that of identity, the relationship between identity and personhood, and its significance to bioethics. She argues that the forming, shaping, expressing, contesting, and maintaining of personal identities is a social practice, an achievement that makes human interaction and therefore society possible. Notions of personhood and identity are key to bioethics at the beginning of life, at the end of life, and at those times when selfhood is diminished. These notions of identity and personhood are perhaps more complex than at other times in history because of the context of current healthcare practices. I feel as if the very famous first lines of Charles Dickens' Tale of Two Cities is an apt description of today's healthcare. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times, it was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. As the space between living and dying becomes larger due to advancing medical knowledge and the technological imperative, identities and personhood are especially important to a moral practice of healthcare. Our own UMN professor of philosophy, Naomi Sheeman, says of the book, quote, "In this wonderfully wise book, Hilde Lindemann weaves stories into a theory to help us see how we weave stories into lives, and how through these stories we hold each other in personhood, for good or ill." This is that book. I just got it, but did have a chance to skim it. It's really worth a read. One thing about Hilde is she says profound things in a most accessible way. So she's very good to read. A major part of this social practice of identity takes place in families, and thus families matter. Today she will talk to us about why families matter. Please join me in welcoming Professor Lindemann.
My blushes for that lovely introduction. Thank you so much. And thank you all for coming to hear this talk. I think it's going to appear in Pediatrics in a little while. I'm not sure exactly when. But before I begin it, I wanted to announce a vigil for Dan Markingson in support of an investigation of research misconduct at the University of Minnesota, which will be held outside McNamara Alumni Center on May 9th. That's a Friday. 12 to 12:45. For those of you who can attend, I urge you to do so. All right, now to the talk. That treatment decisions are not always guided by what's in the medical best interests of a pediatric patient is not in doubt. Consider the very badly damaged neonate whose parents painfully decide they must not consent to a costly course of treatments involving repeated hospitalizations that might prolong the infant's life another year or two because they live a half-day's journey from the hospital and have 3 other young children at home. Decisions like that have been defended by appeals to the principle of justice. John Hardwig, for example, has argued that a patient's right to treatment is circumscribed, like all rights, by the harm it inflicts on others. Considerations aside from justice could also motivate the thought that important interests of individual parents or siblings or sometimes grandparents may override, in certain circumstances, the interests of the pediatric patient. But this focus on what is owed to individual family members obscures attention to what is owed to families, considered not merely as the sum total of the individuals within them, but as morally valuable entities in themselves. While there's little enough mention in the bioethics literature of the husbands, wives, parents, or grown children of patients, except perhaps as proxy decision makers or informal caregivers, almost nothing has been written about the moral relationship between families themselves and medicine. And I find the exclusion of the family's perspective from healthcare ethics peculiar, very widespread, and in need of remedy. So today I'm going to try to remedy that a bit. I'm going to offer some theoretical underpinnings for the idea that familial considerations have to be taken into account in medical decision making, and that sometimes those considerations have a greater claim on healthcare professionals than do the best interests of the pediatric patient. I then consider what is of intrinsic value in families. And I'm going to end up by arguing that a family's ability to provide these goods, and indeed its very existence, can be put at risk when too many demands or the wrong kind of demands are made on it. So let's think about families as entities in themselves. Now these are the functions of families. Have I gone too far? Yeah, there we go. Families come in many configurations and sizes, and the term means different things in different contexts. What I mean by it here is the structure of intimacy in which most people live out their lives, characterized by the relationships that are more or less ongoing and close, usually, but not always, involving long periods of living together in the same household. Ordinarily, but not always, they're structures of love and trust. Although even when those are absent, the vulnerability that's produced by the intimacy within the family gives rise to special responsibilities of care, consideration, and commitment. On a liberal view of persons as free, autonomous, individual agents, it could be assumed that families are nothing more than the sum of their individual members, and that they have no identity apart from that. Now, I want to argue the contrary. Families are social institutions with their own histories, features, and functions. Ferdinand Schumann calls the family an intimate arrangement having its own goals and purposes. an organic and enduring entity. And it's all of that. Families endure by shapeshifting. People are born into and die out of them. They abandon them. They enter them by marriage or other long-term commitments such as adoption, and they reconfigure them by divorce or remarriage. But while families change shape over time, they also have their own distinctive characteristics. A family might, for example, be Amish or Roman Catholic, even though not everybody in the family fits that description. It might be working class or wealthy, descended from the Mayflower, Boston Irish. Some families produce athletes in every generation. Others tend toward the arts. Some have a strong work ethic. And still others are blended or interracial or queer or farm or refugee. Now, it could be objected that family is simply a shorthand for the web of the interrelationships among the individuals who form one, valued only insofar as the people in them are valued. But sometimes it seems we act for the sake of the family even when we don't value some of the individuals in it. Nobody likes Grandpa Schultz very much. He's an ill-tempered bully, and he's selfish to boot. And how Grandma Schultz puts up with him, nobody in the family can understand. But today's his birthday. And while 12-year-old Sally protests that she has a soccer game she has to go to, her parents insist that she come with them to the party. Why do I have to? Sally wants to know. Because he's family, right? Now, in a pediatric context, the family that matters is that of the pediatric patient. This may consist paradigmatically of the child's biological mother, father, and siblings, but it might not. Many children live in single-parent families or adoptive or foster families. Others live with a grandmother or aunt and perhaps cousins. Still others live in reconfigured families with a biological parent, a step-parent, and step-siblings, with or without visits to the other biological parent. However that might be, from the time of the child's birth, the family perform a number of crucial functions in the child's life. And what follows is by no means an exclusive, exhaustive list, but it does serve as a reminder of why families are instrumentally valuable, why each of us values our family. First and most obviously, families are responsible for preserving the child's life. This duty comprises not only feeding, clothing, and sheltering the child, but also keeping her from harm. Parents or other adults in the role of parents have to provide I'm having PowerPoint issues. This is the wrong set of slides for you all. So pay no attention, just listen to me talk. I'll try to carry this off by force of my personality. We'll see how that goes. So, preserving the child's life. This duty comprises not only feeding, clothing, and sheltering the child, but also keeping her from harm. Parents or other adults in the role of parents have to provide as secure an environment as their resources allow, which includes, among other things, teaching older siblings to be gentle with the baby, making sure that the child's immunizations are up to date, fastening the child's seatbelt if the family has access to a car, taking her to the doctor when she's ill. Siblings have to keep sharp implements away from the child, refrain from slamming doors in her face, involving her in dangerous play, protecting her from neighborhood bullies, keeping her from running out into the street. Second, and this is also obvious, but it's often overlooked, the family is the foundry in which the child's identity is forged. It's the family that establishes a proto-identity for her before she's even born. She is Candle Smith, daughter of June Smith and Maria Garcia, little sister to Carlos, native of North Carolina. These and other important facts about her are woven into the stories and fragments of stories that parents, siblings, and other family members create or draw on to depict the child as she grows and changes over time. And it's that narrative tissue that constitutes the child's identity. As the child acquires a self and then becomes self-aware, third-person stories that were all the identity she originally had are gradually augmented by the first-person stories that constitute her own sense of who she is. But that probably doesn't happen until she's at least 6 years old. Before then, those who are intimately connected to her both construct her identity and then maintain it, hold her in it. That's why the title of my book is Holding and Letting Go. They hold her in it by treating her according to their narrative sense of who she is. While many people hold us in our identities, the ongoing intimacy of families makes them particularly well suited to perform that function. That's why when Carlos teases little Candle until she cries, or Maria is laid off from a job that's been important to her self-conception, or June is suffering from an illness, a serious one that loosens her grip on herself, they look to the others in the family to reassure them as to who they really are. Third function of families, that's socializing children. Consider what this involves. It includes teaching them to talk, walk, feed and dress themselves, interact in a civilized manner with others. Sometimes they could do that. But it's also a matter of giving children their second nature and thereby initiating them into a specific form of life. Second nature, as Aristotle understood it, is human nature, the disposition to virtue that's instilled in us on top of our animal nature by good upbringing, so that we're fit to take our place in human society. Where Aristotle thought of it largely as moral formation, for John McDowell, our second nature also comprises our disposition to act rationally. To acquire second nature is to acquire the concepts that let us connect our minds to the world. Because of our second nature, we can simultaneously be of the world and know the world, acting in it according to the moral and other reasons that we see there. Like McDowell, I believe that an absolutely central element in the acquisition of our second nature is learning language. It's in speaking to children, singing, commanding, exclaiming, making jokes, employing sarcasm, requesting, thanking, cursing, greeting, praying. The families not only open the gates for children to the rational and moral world, but also show them what to do when they get inside. Stanley Cavell explains what we learn along with language acquisition this way. When you say, "I love my love," the child may learn the meaning of the word love and what love is, i.e., that what you do will be love in the child's world. And if it is mixed with resentment and intimidation, then love is a mixture of resentment and intimidation. And when love is sought, that is what will be sought. When you say, "I'll take you tomorrow, I promise," the child begins to learn what temporal durations are and what trust is, and what you do will show what trust is worth. When you say, "Put on your sweater," the child learns what commands are and what authority is, and if giving orders is something that creates anxiety for you, then authorities are anxious, authority itself uncertain. Of course, hopefully the person growing will learn other things about these concepts and objects also. They will grow gradually as the child's world grows. That's Stanley Cavell. Acquisition of language is thus also initiation into how we do things, a particular culture's socially shared behavior and ways of understanding. For as we learn language, we also learn the shared roots of interest and feeling, modes of response, senses of humor and of significance and of fulfillment, of what's outrageous, what's similar to what else, what's a rebuke, what's forgiveness, when an utterance is an assertion, when it's an appeal, when it's an explanation. All the world of organism that Wittgenstein calls forms of life. And it's a child's family that initiates her into language with all that that entails. So we can see that a person's family gives her not only herself, but also her world. Now, a fourth function of families is to nurture children. This is a matter of giving the emotional, intellectual, and spiritual support that will allow them to grow. Families nurture their adult members too, of course. A good husband, for example, nurtures his wife by coming to hear her first solo performance with the church choir. Good siblings nurture with financial assistance and maybe shelter when a grown sister or brother needs help exiting an abusive relationship. The nurture of the young proceeds on much the same lines. The child's parents, siblings, grandparents, and other intimates encourage her to try new things, affirm her curiosity and creativity, help her overcome her fears, nourish her imagination, and give her hope. Now, a fifth function of families, and this is the last of them, that I'm going to mention, there are more, this is to nurse children, and of course adult members too, when they're ill, joining forces with the healthcare professionals when the illness is too serious for home remedies. When the child's nursed at home, siblings participate in giving the needed care. They bring daddy the bottle of Tylenol or cough syrup. They find and start the child's favorite movie. They wake mama in the middle of the night when the child is vomited. Grandparents or other family members who aren't part of the household are often recruited as informal caregivers as well, especially when the child's parent or parents have to be away for large parts of the day. When the child is hospitalized for a lengthy period of time, it's the parents alone who divide the responsibility for the child's care with healthcare professionals. That parents are visible to the healthcare team while the rest of the family has receded into the background may account in part for the relative inattention to the family as a whole in the bioethics literature. Now, if, as this partial list of familial functions suggests, families are valuable for what they can do for us, they're also valuable for what they are in themselves. And again, when I give you this next list, I'll focus on the family of the pediatric patient. And again, what follows isn't meant to be exhaustive. It's just to serve as a reminder of what good enough, imperfect families are actually like. Let's see. We have the right slide. First, families are places of love. Now, it's often said that children need love just as much as they need food, clothing, and the other goods and services that families provide. So it might be thought that love makes families instrumentally, not inherently, valuable. But that's to mistake the nature of love. It's not a service like clean clothes in a drawer or a good like a hot dinner. It's rather a specific kind of interpersonal connection. When the child's an infant, the connection's one-sided. The parents give and the child receives. But what they give is themselves. They open their hearts and lives to the child, offering it the best of who they are. It's an invitation which, if the connection is to remain loving rather than degenerating into exploitation, must be reciprocated as soon as the child is old enough to do that. Otherwise, the child is simply using the parents for what it can get. As the child grows, those in the family who love her teach her how to love them back, until in time she learns how to love maturely. And because familial connections are human, the love that informs them is imperfect. It's always mixed with less desirable elements: selfishness, inattention, domination, fear, indifference, anger. Nevertheless, love is prized and sought for its own sake. And that much of it is to be found in families is a partial explanation of their inherent value. Second, families are also the site where lives are shared. The activities, routines, and events that are the stuff of family life tie its members together in an ongoing history that's common to all, though each person experiences it differently. What happens to one affects the others, particularly the children who are entirely dependent on the rest. And indeed, the intertwining of lives is essential to the identity formation and maintenance that goes on in families. It's the people you share your life with who are most often directly implicated in the important acts, experiences, roles, relationships, characteristics, and commitments around which your identity constituting stories are woven. And that's part of the reason why these people are so important to you. For better or worse, in good enough families, the sense of security that comes from knowing that we do not navigate this world alone can be worth a good deal. We value the ability to share our lives and selves. We find it tragic when a child can't do that. Because identities are part of what we value when we value people, and these are bound up with the people whose lives we share, that sharing is in itself valuable. Third, as they live out their lives together, family members encumber their children with a thick conception of the good, a specific understanding of what makes life worthwhile. Now, it's important not to romanticize this. The family might live by a code of honor that requires avenging any insult, no matter how slight, or by protecting the purity of female members by sequestering them. But that danger can't be helped. Wherever there's enduring intimacy, there will be value-infused outlooks, attitudes, priorities, and ways of proceeding that are shared in common and that give a specific shape to the child's life. These thick conceptions of the good are necessary for what Charles Taylor calls strong evaluation. Evaluations that involve discrimination of right and wrong, which aren't rendered valid only by our own desires or inclinations, but rather stand independent of those and offer standards by which they can be judged. So you think about the weak evaluator who evaluates her first-order desires and chooses the one that produces the most satisfaction. Say the child wants the Star Wars Legos for her birthday, but she also wants the Iron Man costume. And she picks the Legos because she thinks they'll be more fun, and that's all there is to it. The strong evaluator understands that her desires themselves can be evaluated in terms of their worth, and she endorses or repudiates them with the aim of making herself into a morally good person. This is all according to Taylor. The adult who once played Star Wars and Iron Man reflects on the institutionalized sexist violence that pervades her society and does not want to be the kind of person who's complicit in that in any way, and especially not as a form of entertainment. So she judges her desire to play Grand Theft Auto to be unworthy of her, and she goes bowling instead. Now, if Taylor's right, adults engage the values that inhere in their conception of the good, not only to regulate their first-order desires, but to strengthen their moral character. And for a child to learn how to do that, she's going to have to make use of whatever the conceptions of the good are that are available to her, and those will be in her family. That's why it matters that families encumber their children with their own sense of what's valuable and worthwhile. In opening children up to the range of values that are found in the world, families are the conditions for the possibility of the child's moral agency. And as that agency is valued in itself, so are the conditions for it. And fourth, the family is the child's home. As that, it's the security and stability that grounds the child's life. Now again, it's important not to romanticize this. In concrete practice, alcoholism, parental death or abandonment, serious illness, domestic violence, constant fighting, sexual abuse, and other evils make a nightmare of a child's home. Idealized, the notion of home has often been insufferably petty bourgeois and oppressive of women. But Iris Marian Young, among others, has defended home as the material anchor for a sense of agency and a shifting and fluid identity. An anchor that's particularly necessary for the rapidly growing and changing child. Home surrounds us with the objects, artifacts, rituals, and practices that configure who we are in our particularity, and it gives context to our lives. To be sure, for Young, home is conceptually distinct from family because it also includes the domestic space inhabited by individuals who are living on their own. But for children, home and family are one thing. Family members, the home consists of the family that makes that domestic space the child's own. And the way that space is made is when family members care for their possessions and transmit the value of that care to the younger generation. Family members do this when they look after and love one another in that place. They make home when they use that place for the daily routines, familiar rituals, and special celebrations that affirm the identity of the family. And it's these people that Robert Frost had in mind when he wrote, "Home is the place where, if you have to go there, they have to take you in." They have to because you belong there. You're one of them. When the child is old enough to make a new home for herself, home and family are no longer coextensive. But even then, and perhaps especially in times of need and dependency, home is still family. However the family may have reconfigured itself over the years, her family is her rightful place in the world, the ground of her life and being. And once again, because her life and being are inherently valuable, that ground is too. Now, it's always difficult to make a case for a thing's inherent value, and I can't hope to persuade everybody here that families should be valued in that way. I think they should, but even if I'm wrong about that, it's enough for the purposes of my argument if I've shown that families possess instrumental value, because that alone gives us a reason to care for families and keep them safe from harm. Yeah. Serious illness puts pressure not only on an individual family member, but also on the family itself. The care of an acutely ill child requires the family to channel many of its resources toward a single member, an arrangement that can usually be sustained for a while, but it can't be continued indefinitely while the other members do without. Illness disrupts ordinary familial functions, and if it's serious enough, it threatens to break the family altogether. When a child is gravely ill, the family function of nursing is ordinarily turned over to healthcare professionals, and that means that the families no longer have primary control over how it's done. Yet, some of that care can't be provided in the same way by even the most attentive professional staff, precisely because the staff aren't part of the family. It's one thing when a hospital nurse gives medication that makes the pain go away, and quite another thing when mama does it, because mama transmits the comfort of love, familiarity, and connection along with the dose. The inability to give familial care in a hospital setting, even when the family recognizes the need for professional help and is grateful for it, may leave family members feeling helpless and at a loss, frustrated by not being able to do what they do best. It's not only the nursing function that's disrupted in times of serious illness. When parents have to spend every spare moment in the hospital, the child's siblings or frail elderly relatives may find themselves less well protected than they are in happier times. They may be frightened by the long parental absences, unsettled by the change in their routines, less well supervised by people who aren't thoroughly familiar with their needs and proclivities, more prone to engage in dangerous activities. And at the same time, the parents may feel guilty that they can't be at home, worried about the other children's well-being, frustrated by their inability to look after the frail elders who need them. Grandparents, aunts, and uncles, or family friends who are close to the children can go some distance toward taking the parent's place at home. But unlike professional caregivers who can be replaced by equally qualified others, family members are not interchangeable, and children in particular know that very well. Identity maintenance also undergoes a special strain when a child's hospitalized for long periods of time. If the patient is a baby, the family's function of creating her identity is disrupted when the infant is torn from the nest of relationships in which that work takes place. If she's an older child, her sense of herself may be threatened, first by her illness and then by her isolation from the familial intimates who hold her in her identity. And nor is she the only one likely to be facing difficulties here. Her parents may find their own identities under siege because they can't perform their parental roles in the usual way. Stress, worry, and sleeplessness can contribute to their sense of inadequacy or anger and reduce their ability to maintain either their own or their loved ones' identities. And once again, those at home may be less able to cope and find that their grip on themselves has weakened. Serious illness also retards socialization and nurturing. The pediatric patient may be slow to muster the linguistic and social skills of healthy children her age, or be emotionally immature or destructively self-centered. Siblings may pick up on the tensions in the home and regress on all fronts. As money and time may be scarcer than usual, middle-class families may be forced to curtail music lessons or soccer practice, while low-income families might have to do without decent food, clothing, or health care. Now, all that is bad enough, but healthcare professionals and medical ethicists who don't well understand the relationship between families and medicine can make matters even worse. For example, providers tend to treat families of pediatric patients primarily as sources of unpaid care. High-tech treatments that can be given at home, such as ventilator care or dialysis, thrust family members with no medical training into positions of serious responsibility. When a baby born at 25 weeks gestation is discharged from the NICU that has saved her life but left her with serious damage to lungs and brain, neonatologists may take it for granted that her family will provide the years of unrelenting care that will now be required. Parents may be called on to learn how to insert a nasogastric tube or perform high-frequency chest wall oscillation, or to devote significant amounts of time providing physiotherapy. And if a kidney or liver lobe is required, healthcare providers may assume that family members will just naturally volunteer. Now, this cavalier attitude toward families is arguably born of nothing worse than misunderstanding or forgetting what families are for. Another, more pernicious attitude arises out of the clash between healthcare ethics, which is patient-centered and individualistic, and the ethics of families, which is neither. In families where the ethos is much more communal and relational, people will sometimes behave in ways that from a professional, patient-centered perspective may seem flat-out immoral. And medical ethicists who are trained in the impartialist, individualist moral theories originally designed to govern interactions in the public sphere have been deeply suspicious of families as well. As a result, there's what amounts to a default setting of distrust, a presumption on the part of clinicians and bioethicists that a family is just as likely as not to be neglectful or abusive or selfish. A parent's decision not to visit the patient every day because her energy and attention are also required at home can be seen by the staff as callous or possibly even neglectful. A parent's insistence that a protesting child participate in a clinical trial by giving blood can be seen by ethicists as abusive rather than as holding the child to the family's conception of the good. Parents' requests for growth attenuation therapy for a profoundly impaired child can be construed by health professionals as a demand that the child's bodily integrity be violated solely because the family is too lazy and selfish to provide respectful care, rather than recognizing that it could enhance the child's participation in family life. It's not that families should always prevail in such disputes. I don't mean that at all. My point is merely that the expression of a distinct family-oriented perspective strikes many professional caregivers as illegitimate, as undermining familial claims to care. And this distrust can add to the strain that families are already under, posing a threat to their identities. It can call into question everything that is inherently valuable about families, casting doubt on how well they love, whether the lives in them are exploited rather than shared, whether their conception of the good is good enough, and how adequately they function as a home. When coupled with greatly heightened demands on families' capacity for care, this attitude on the part of clinicians, as bolstered by medical ethicists, can damage families' own sense of who they are and of why that matters. Like the people within them, families under pressure need to be held in their identities by caring others who recognize what's valuable about them and treat them on the basis of that recognition. Otherwise, they're at risk of losing their integrity, perhaps to the point where they cease to be a family at all. We medical ethicists may be forgiven for not having developed a robust account of the moral interface between families and medicine. The moral theories on which we standardly draw simply aren't well equipped to handle relations of intimacy and dependence. And while almost all of us have families of our own, we mostly just appreciate them without stopping to think very much about why that's so. So in this talk, I've only been able to provide the merest sketch of the sorts of things about families that matter, but I've also tried to show why we all, ethicists and clinicians alike, might need to take families a little more seriously. What's at stake is the well-being not only of our sickest children, but of the webs of love and connection within which they live. Thank you. So we have time for some questions? So everybody just agrees with me because I said such wonderful things. That's nice. Susan.
I can be counted on.
I know. All right.
So I wonder how this perspective, Hilde, you think would help with the debate that's going on right now in genetics, that I think is a wonderful test case
Okay.
for this. So, I mean, the brief version of this is that, as you know, for about 20 years, the consensus has been that parents are really not entitled to perform genetic testing on kids for adult onset disorders.
Right, right.
That the better course is to wait because of the child's separateness.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So that the child at 18 or whenever the child, if ever the child chooses to address this issue, can make their own decision.
Mm-hmm.
Because this is not information needed to preserve their health in childhood. Very recently, though, the argument has been made that it would be good to give the parents information about adult onset disorders
Mm-hmm.
because it might benefit the parents themselves or other family members who would be alerted to genetic conditions within the family, and consequently indirectly benefit the kid by perhaps prolonging the life or averting illness in a family member. The cost of doing that is that the kid then no longer has this choice later.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it's a really stark trade-off
Mm.
between the growing fullness and separateness and individuality of the child versus the family. So how does this thinking help with that very active dispute?
This is a lovely and very clearly laid out question, I think. On the one hand, there are always tensions in families between togetherness and separateness, and no good family squelches the child's separateness. That's part of what we do when we nurture and socialize our children, is to give them a robust sense of their individuality. So that's for starters. But now we're going to talk about encumbrances. Here's another way in which families very often close off a choice for their children. They take them to church. And when they do that, they socialize them to go to church. They are burdening them with a particular set of religious values and so on, which it's true that when the child is older, it can repudiate if it wants to, but it still has all that knowledge of what that religion is like. And this is done in part so that the child can participate in these religious ceremonies that the family thinks valuable, but also in part because it reaffirms this family as a family that does, that is Jewish or that is Muslim or that is Christian or whatever. And so in a way you could think of that as closing off something about the child's future. Now when it comes to genetic testing, there's a whole lot more going on there than just you're encumbering the child with a kind of knowledge that it can't escape and that it can't make a decision later about whether it wants to know it. There's also the question of where the money is coming from for this kind of testing, in whose interests is it that the tests be performed and so on. But it does not seem to me that there is much of a moral difference between having a child know this thing about her own genome, which she might have preferred not to know, and then when she's grown, deciding what, if anything, she wants to do about it, and with encumbering the child with a particular religious tradition, which, when she is grown, she can make choices about what she wants to do about that. And I do think families encumber each other. And they often require people in the family to do things they might not have wanted to do in the interests of family solidarity. So it's always a question of how much solidarity, how little room is there for individual action? Is the family going to be an oppressive family? Is the family going to encourage individual flourishing? Or on the other hand, is the family going to efface itself so much in the interests of individualism that the child doesn't even feel like the family matters at all? These are all questions that I think can't easily be answered, but it's good to tease apart the various things that are at stake there. So if you want a short answer, is it okay for families to do this? I don't know. I don't know. It would depend on the family and what the dangers are in that family. If the family's tendencies are to suppress individuality, then I'd say no, don't let them do that. If the family is respectful of the individuals in it, then it seems to me it might be quite all right. What do you think?
What do I think?
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad to hear you elaborate that the functions of the family, that another function, maybe that could go on the slide, is nurturing a child's growing separateness.
Yes, yes.
Because that does seem to me a core paradoxical duty.
Absolutely it is,
of the
yes,
parent.
yes.
I think it's that makes this a hard question,
Mm-hmm.
but one where I myself am skeptical of parents inflicting on kids the sword of Damocles that you've got BRCA2 variant.
I'm with you. I wouldn't do it either myself.
So I'm skeptical of recent calls to abandon that 20-year consensus, but it's interesting to hear you filter that through your thinking on this.
Anybody else? Oh, yes.
Do you see any tension between law, which really American law is focused very much or supports autonomy, and your thesis about family-centered decision-making? We recently had a case in our Bioethics Committee about a child, and one member of the committee was arguing for more family-centered decision-making process, which was really antithetical to the way we had been processing most every other case that had presented itself.
Yeah, I think that the emphasis on autonomy is a good thing. I would not want us to get rid of the settled moral understanding that that has to be respected. But I think that the focus on it sometimes shears off attention to other considerations that are equally important. And I think that that's often what the danger is if you're looking only at the individual patient and not thinking about how the patient comes attached to other people who matter to the patient. And just take medical decision making, just an ordinary case of adult patient medical decision making. When the adult is no longer competent to make her own decisions, then we have laws that require the use of substituted judgment, where it's known what the patient might have wanted. But there, it's as if we think that there's a decision there, that if you could just lift off the top of the patient's head, you could pull out that decision and know what to do, and the family can do that. When we know it doesn't work like that. You think about the last big decision you had to make, whether it was about medical treatment or, heck, buying a car. You're going to consult usually your spouse or people who are very close to you. Maybe you have an intimate friend who functions as a family member, and you're going to work together to figure out what the decision is. And in hospitals, patients do that all the time. They don't know what they think about what they want. They can't make a decision until they've processed it, usually with a family member. So if you leave out that piece of how decisions are made because your focus is just on the autonomy of that individual, you're missing something that is actually going on that has some moral importance to it. And again, this is why I think families are sometimes treated with distrust and suspicion, because it seems like they're inserting themselves into the patient-centered ethos that professional health care givers are taught. But why would we think that families operate on a patient-centered ethos? That's bizarre. We wouldn't want to take it for granted that that's what families are supposed to be doing. And that's all I'm arguing for, is for a little leeway so that some of these other morally important considerations can be seen. Steve, I knew you would have an objection. I hope it's a good one.
Well, I like the distinction between the intrinsic, or between the inherent and the instrumental.
Yeah.
And I agree with you that the distrust is partly on whether or not the families are fulfilling these various roles. But I think a big part of the debate is a debate over who owns the definition of what a family is. And you really didn't define a family.
And I'm not gonna.
Well, I'm going to ask you to anyway, because I think one of the questions is, who owns the definition? For example, it's easy for society externally to say, well, we're not going to accept gay and lesbian parents as constituting a family. That's one way of doing it. But then you have the gay and lesbian parents, for example, asserting we are a family. But I think a much more interesting question is, how does a kid define family? Mm-hmm. And if you went underneath this argument, you'd rise at the question of, if you were going to have a definition of family that was defined by the kid, what would it look like?
See, I think that family is relative to the specific individual. I think back to when my first husband left me and then I remarried. And after that, my oldest kid had a picture that she had in her college dorm room. And it was on a hinged frame. In one half, there was a picture of Jim and me. In the other half was a picture of her other parents. And all of those people were her family. Whereas I did not by any means consider my ex-husband part of my family. And I wouldn't want him at my bedside. She would have. And I think we have to honor who people themselves consider to be their family. And if that's subjective, then so be it. Now, I know that isn't going to work for particular sorts of policies. Insurance companies are going to have pretty strict rules about who gets to be covered on your family health insurance, for sure. And that can't be helped. But in hospitals, we can help it. In hospitals, we can say that if a patient considers somebody close family and necessary to be there, then they are. And so for a lesbian couple, if she wants her wife there, then by golly, her wife should be there. There's no reason why she shouldn't.
Yeah, although to take the kid's side, it would seem to me it'd be fairly easy to ask the kid to define their family.
Yeah.
And then the question would be whether you take the kid's definition of who their family was over those who had de facto family status, that is the legal parents or legal guardians.
It depends on for what purposes. It's not only relative to the kid, it's also relative to why are you asking the question. If you need to find out who is going to speak for the child, who is the designated decision maker, the kid can't be, a little kid, a 5-year-old kid, shouldn't be in charge of that one. That's one that the parents are going to have to argue out. And if they're separated or divorced or something like that, they got to figure it out. And there do arise conflicts around that kind of thing, of course. But there isn't any fixed answer to that sort of question, because families operate differently, and in different families, it's whatever that family's ordinary practices are. So I don't see that there's any way to adjudicate that from outside the family. But it always depends, for any question about families, I want to say, well, why are you asking that question? If you give me some specific reason why you want to know, then I can give you a specific answer. Yeah? This is one of the reasons why there's always that sort of trouble, like when there's somebody in a persistent vegetative state and somebody who's in the family wants to stop treatment, and somebody else who's in the family says, no, we mustn't because she's not really in a persistent vegetative state. She smiled at me yesterday or whatever it is. You get these conflicts like that. And that's why you need sometimes to go to court to sort out who has the standing there to make a decision of that kind. Although mostly you don't have to go to court. That's pretty rare that that happens. Because on the whole, and for the most part, families are good enough, and they figure out in a good enough way how to settle their differences. Yeah.
So you alluded briefly as an example to growth attenuation cases, and I was wondering if you could kind of expand on that and sort of tease out
Oh boy,
things
that's,
about that. I know it's a tough one.
that's a tough one, and I think the coffee after this talk is going to be devoted to that. Let me just sort of briefly say that I don't know whether in any specific case growth attenuation is the best way to handle that problem for the family. I do think, though, that it is not out of bounds or morally illegitimate for families to request that kind of treatment because they need their own lives to be made easier for them. If that gets called convenience, and convenience is a bad word in the clinic because, oh, we don't do things for family members' convenience. We need to get a grip in the clinic and notice what convenience actually entails. That often means noticing what kind of burden of caregiving is imposed by not having the right kind of social structure or the money to buy the lifts that would help in a family situation, or a whole host of other things, possibly not a good available institutional care near enough by so the family can stay connected to the person, and a whole range of other things. So it is a very complicated question, but I don't want anybody to think that convenience automatically disqualifies family from consideration. That's all, really. That's complicated. Yeah.
Can you speak to uncertainty of medical diagnosis and prognosis, and then the role that parents should have in determining whether treatment options go forward or stop?
Well, one of the ways I want to think about that is to remind us that everybody is fallible. It's not only families who can make mistakes about what kind of healthcare choice they pick. It's also healthcare givers don't always get it right. And that's because there is a great deal of uncertainty about certain sorts of situations in which some kind of decision has to be made. We can't always know. There are 25-week-old babies who can live good and full lives because they aren't severely damaged by brain bleeds or lungs that aren't functioning very well or all the rest of that stuff. So it's not that never happens. It's just at 24 and 25 weeks, we can't know for sure. They're just odds. And healthcare providers are really no better at calculating the odds than lay people are. There are good studies in the sociological literature that attest to that. So we're all acting under uncertainty here. And I think the best we can do there is figure out what is reasonable and what is immoral, just flat out immoral, and why. What are your reasons for saying that that's immoral? And to remember that whatever happens with a kid like that, it's the family who will be left literally holding the baby. They're the ones who have to put in the work of taking care of this child if they got the decision wrong, and so on. So uncertainty that's part of the human condition, and maybe even more so in medicine than is often thought, because medicine is based on the virtue of optimism, right? We're doing this stuff because we think we can help. We think we can make things better, and often we do. Sometimes we don't. I don't even think I answered your question. Anybody else have? Oh, yeah.
It's just striking me that part of our decision-making in our healthcare decisions as adults, you mentioned autonomy, you've mentioned capacity, there's also informed
Well, yes,
informed
absolutely,
consent.
yes, yes.
And so I'm just wondering what the balance is as, of course, this is not young pediatric, but, you know, older children, where that informed consent balance is between the individual and the family.
Yeah, that's a tough one because it is, after all, that child's body and that child's life. And so to the extent that the child has some sense of what's important to it, you want to hear that. You want to listen. But of course, young children can't take the full responsibility of making decisions that where they can't see far enough ahead what the consequences of that choice might be. But I think, you know, the thought that the parents just have to make those decisions, and then what you want is for the child to approve the decision, but not to make the decision. That's probably as good as we can get. And it's certainly true that some children know a heck of a lot more about their own bodies than the physicians who, in seriatim, you know, we get this lack of continuity of care, pronounce what's going on, because the child has experienced the, you know, the symptoms, or so, especially for a chronic disease. They're quite knowledgeable quite often, and maybe even know more than the parents do about what works for the child and what doesn't, what meds make her feel good, which ones are horrible, and so on. So I think to the extent that the child can be a part of those conversations, it's always a good idea. And of course, that, again, people can get that wrong. That's the other part of the human condition, is that it's fraught with danger all the time. And we are going to make mistakes, and we are going to ruin each other's lives. But we can try not to. How's that for profound? Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on how the imbalance of power should be handled between medicine and families?
Well, I guess that's really what I'm appealing to here, is if physicians and other healthcare practitioners, nurses are usually pretty good about it, and actually so are pediatricians and neonatologists, because the families are so involved in the care there. But to kind of get rid of that default suspicion of families is one way to give families a little more of the power, to share it a little more broadly. And I think a great deal of the imbalance of power comes not from anything that any individual healthcare professional is doing, but from the institutional structures within which medicine is practiced that make it hard to hear the voices of families. Because in the clinic, there is this, it's not just that there's more knowledge, but there's also a highly specialized vocabulary that can exclude the family, which is why I've always really liked Howard Brody's notion of informed consent, which is where you think out loud with the patient in language that the patient can understand about what you see going on and what you think might be the best way to help, and so on. If we can, to the extent possible, avoid the language of the clinic and speak the patient's language, that's a way to help there, I think. That too restores the imbalance of power a little bit. But the power is always going to be on the side of the clinic, because that's where the knowledge is. And Foucault taught us this. Yeah. Yeah, Lisa has.
I have to go back. I'm not sure I can make this question make sense. I have to go back to your list of things that families do.
Yeah. See if I can find it.
They're, as a pediatrician, all those things are recognized, but some of them have like different importances.
Yes.
So preserving the children's life is something that if you do not do, you are legally neglectful and can be punished for.
Yes.
The
Also true of parents. Yeah.
well, and actually families equals parents for.
Yes. Oh, okay. Well, I thought you were talking about the professional caregiver, who is also legally liable.
No, this is the way the professional caregiver will think about the.
Oh, okay, right.
And so number one, preserving the children, so it becomes a duty.
Yeah.
But if the parents don't do, they're in default.
Right,
Then
okay.
we have maintaining their socializing, nurturing. Those are things that you really ought to be doing, and if you're not doing them as a parent, the professional will think of you as a bad parent.
Right.
But we'll probably not legally be able to do anything about it. You'll get your own reward when your kid is 15.
Yes.
And then at the bottom, we have nursing in time of illness.
Yeah.
Which is something that's expected, but not nearly as expected as the other things.
Yeah.
But by putting it on this list, are you making it into a duty that, if not done, makes you a bad parent?
Well, there is such a thing as child neglect, and you can be prosecuted for that too.
So if you don't,
If
so that's a dangerous place to go, I think.
Yeah.
If you are not willing to fully nurse your children in times of illness, do you become legally neglectful?
Well, this is not a legal list of requirements for what families do by any means. Well, but it's also a not legal thing. I mean, the law tracks some of these things, and yes, some things do seem more important than others. If you have allowed your child to be dead, then you can forget the rest of these functions as far as that kid is concerned, obviously. But I don't want to have it be a contest about which things do you do or you're legally prosecuted, because I don't know the law. Ask Susan.
By putting nursing the children on this list, it seems to me you make nursing, caregiving more mandatory than maybe.
Again, I don't think of this as mandatory. This is simply meant as a description of the functions that go on in families that are important to the children in it.
Pediatricians reading this list might read it differently.
Oh,
Begin to make it mandatory.
that would be bad. Well, look, for one thing, when you're doing bioethics, you aren't necessarily advocating for the policing of the values that you are espousing, right? You don't necessarily want to build policy around things that would be morally good to do. That's why ethics and law are not always the same. You want the law to track what's ethically right, and we know there are bad laws, right? So they're not going to necessarily be coextensive. But the other reason you don't want them coextensive is you don't always want a certain thing that would be good to do to be required to do on pain of punishment, right? Yeah.
Because you mentioned this was going into a pediatric journal.
I hear you.
And you have a list that goes from legally mandatory down to we kind of hope you do this, or we expect you to do this.
It's not even we expect you to. These are not, there's the difference, right, between prescriptive and descriptive. This is meant to be purely descriptive. If you are a family, you do those things. So gosh, yeah, let's not make it too prescriptive.
Make sure you don't in the paper.
Yeah. Dorla, did you have a thought?
Well, I guess I think part of what Lisa's getting at is there's nursing responsibilities can really vary from very minor to exceedingly urgent.
You bet.
And that isn't captured in that
No.
phrase up there.
No.
So some things might be very reasonable to expect of others,
Well,
and other things might be very classic.
That's why I unpacked it later on in the talk, that where here the example of nursing might just be a kid brings daddy the Tylenol or something, but then later on I did talk about extreme caregiving. So yes, there's that whole gamut, not all of which ought to be required or expected, and some of which requires much more social support than this country is willing to give it at the moment. Yeah. Yes?
Speaking of countries, it seems you have a
framework for thinking about families that's really universal.
No, it's not.
Well, it at least captures a lot of variation
Yeah.
between families. And I'm wondering what you think about how this could be taken to other countries that play by different rules. Like, would other countries even have the debate between what does the doctor say and what does the family say? Is that like strictly an American thing?
It's not.
Like, maybe the doctor even has a say.
It's not strictly American, but I can speak only for other countries that I've worked in as a bioethicist, and that would be the UK and France and the Netherlands. And in the UK, the practices are much closer to what we do here in the United States than they are on continental Europe. On the continent, there is more what we would consider physician paternalism. Fewer choices are laid before families, and doctors will often just go ahead and do what they think needs doing. And there can be justifications for that, for sure. That is the autonomy, the exercise of autonomy of the patient could be in saying to a doctor, I want you to treat this. And then the doctor can take it from there, because what the patient is doing in her exercise of autonomy is saying, I trust you to take care of me. It doesn't have to work that way. It all depends on what the understanding was between the parties at the time of that initial encounter. But I think in Europe, it's generally seen that the autonomy covers a whole lot of little micro choices that don't have to all be assented to. Any of you remember the rules for kissing and public displays of affection at Amherst College some years ago? They were very worried about rape. And so they had a set of rules of what you had to ask explicit permission to do. May I hold your hand? May I hug you? May I kiss your cheek? All the way to, you want to do it, right? And I think sometimes in the United States, we have an Amherst list of rules, and we think that that's what an exercise of autonomy is. And I think they don't see it quite that way in Europe.
I think we're one of the few nations who has like prescription drug commercials that say, ask your doctor about this, like suggest your doctor do his job
Yeah,
this way.
yeah.
It seems to me that there are countries out there that would be.
Well, most including this country, us in the 1960s, that would have been appalling. A dreadful breach of medical ethics for drug companies to advertise that way, which just shows you what capitalism can do when it puts its mind to it. Yeah.
Well, thank you all for coming. Please join me in thanking.
Thank you for your attention.